Today, we're talking about a moment in history when an empire that was expanding at this unbelievable rate, just slammed into a wall. I mean, in a single century, it had exploded out of the Arabian deserts all the way to the shores of the Atlantic. And then, just like that, the expansion stopped cold.
You know, the early Arab caliphates just seemed completely unstoppable. By the 8th century, they were so successful that the great historian Edward Gibbon looked at this and saw their halt not as some minor setback, but as a huge historical puzzle. He basically asked, how was Western civilization saved from what he saw as an inevitable danger?
So what did stop them? Well, the answer really comes in three parts. You've got a wall of fire in the east, a hammer blow in the west, and maybe most importantly, a poison that was already spreading from within the empire itself.
Okay, so the first great test for the empire came at the gates of the Byzantines. Their capital, Constantinople, was truly the prize of the world. And the caliphate sent these massive forces, not just once, but twice, to try and take it.
For years, the caliphate threw literally everything it had against the city. These sieges were epic. We're talking hundreds of thousands of soldiers, vast naval fleets. But Constantinople's legendary walls held firm, and its defenders fought with this desperation of a people who were protecting their very existence. But their biggest advantage, it wasn't stone, it wasn't steel, it was fire.
And this secret weapon was called Greek fire. You gotta understand, this was the cutting-edge military tech of its day. Just imagine a liquid flame that you couldn't put out with water. In fact, it seemed to burn on water. This made it the perfect weapon against ships, and the Byzantines guarded its formula like their most important state secret.
The psychological effect alone was terrifying. I mean, listen to that description. People who saw it didn't just describe a weapon, they described a monster. This liquid flame, shot from these tubes on ships, literally turned the sea into an inferno. It wiped out entire fleets and just shattered the will of the attackers.
So the eastern door to Europe is slammed shut at Constantinople. So the Caliphate's armies decide to surge through the western entrance. After they conquered Spain, they crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and pushed deep into the heart of France, really threatening to swallow up all of Europe.
And the scale of this invasion is just staggering. Think about it, a continuous march of over 1,000 miles from where they started. The armies just rolled over the southern provinces of Gaul, they sacked cities, and they pushed north relentlessly. It really seemed like nothing could stand in their way.
And here's Gibbon again, just perfectly capturing what was at stake. This wasn't just some battle for territory. It was a battle for the future identity of an entire continent. If this army wasn't stopped, the whole cultural, religious, and political story of Western Europe could have been completely different.
But it was stopped. Right there, between Tours and Poitiers, the invading army finally met its match. The Frankish leader, a guy named Charles, commanded this incredibly disciplined force of infantry that famously stood like a solid wall against wave after wave of cavalry charges. The Franks just held their ground. The invading general, Abdul-Rahman, was killed, and the tide of the invasion just broke. And for the sheer force of his blows, Charles earned a new name, Martel, or the Hammer.
So, okay, the empire was checked at its farthest borders, but some of the biggest challenges weren't coming from the outside. While these huge armies were fighting in France and at the walls of Constantinople, a really devastating conflict was tearing the empire apart from the inside.
This was a massive dynastic struggle for control of the caliphate. You had the ruling Ommiades, who used the color white, and they were challenged by the Abbassides, who flew these black banners. The Abbassides claimed they had a more direct lineage to the Prophet's family and basically accused the Ommiades of being corrupt and not pious enough. And this rivalry just exploded into a brutal, widespread civil war.
The Abbasid victory was, well, it was absolute and just utterly ruthless. They didn't just defeat the Umayyads, they tried to exterminate them. This chilling account from Gibbon describes how 80 members of the Umayyad family were lured to a banquet, promised peace, only to be murdered while their conquerors feasted right over their bodies.
So, this civil war just shattered the political unity of the Islamic world.
While the Abbassides took control in the east, a single Umayyad survivor actually escaped the massacre and made it all the way to Spain, where he set up a rival caliphate. Before long, a third faction would rise in Egypt. The single unified empire, it was gone. Forever. It was replaced by these competing hostile dynasties.
So you put it all together. The defeat at Constantinople, the defeat at Tours, and this internal civil war. These three events completely changed the course of history. The era of explosive, unified expansion was over. And what came next was something very, very different.
As that military ambition faded, the Caliphs, now in their new capital of Baghdad, they turned their focus inward, towards a pursuit of luxury on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. I mean, we are talking about palaces with trees made of solid gold and silver, with little mechanical birds that actually sang on their branches. The tough, disciplined vibe of the first caliphs was totally replaced by the incredible splendor of the old Persian kings.
But right in the middle of all this wealth and power, one of the most magnificent of these rulers, Abd al-Rahman of Spain, the descendant of that lone Umayyad survivor, he kept a private journal. And near the end of his 50-year reign, he looked back and he made this startling calculation. He counted up the number of days of pure, genuine happiness he had ever experienced in his life. The number was 14.
It's such a profound statement, right? It's about the total disconnect between having all this external power and finding any internal contentment. Here was a man who had everything the world could possibly offer: riches, power, pleasure, and he found true happiness in only 2 weeks of his entire life. It's just a stunningly human moment, save for us in the pages of history.
And so ultimately, the story of this empire's sudden stop leaves us with this question. Was it the unbreakable walls and the secret fire of Constantinople? Was it the iron will of the Frankish hammer? Or was it the internal poison of rivalry and civil war? The history seems to suggest that the most powerful empires often carry the seeds of their own destruction inside them, a timeless lesson on just how fragile power really is.
All right, let's dive right in. We're going back to the 10th century, to the Byzantine Empire. And on the surface, this civilization seemed to have it all. I mean, we're talking unimaginable wealth, a direct line to the glories of ancient Rome and Greece, and a capital city that was the absolute envy of the world. But, as you know, appearances can be, well, deceiving.
And that brings us to the central puzzle of the Byzantine Empire, a place of just incredible contrasts that the great historian Edward Gibbon so brilliantly broke down. He painted this picture of a society that was magnificent, sure, but also kind of sterile. A gilded cage that perfectly preserved the past, but seemed completely incapable of creating a future. So let's start with the gold, because there was a lot of it. Get this. According to a traveler back then, this was the number of gold pieces that flowed into the emperor's treasury. Not every year, not every month, every single day. Just from the markets and merchants of Constantinople. It's an almost unbelievable river of wealth. To really get the paradox of Byzantium, you first have to appreciate its sheer, overwhelming splendor, the dazzling face it showed to the world. This wasn't just some empire. It was the richest, most populous state in all of Christendom, period. So where did all this cash come from? Well, Constantinople was the global hub of its day. You had tributes flowing in, merchants from every corner of the known world crowding its ports, and it held this incredibly lucrative monopoly on the most prized luxury good of the age, silk. Gibbon called it a copious and perennial stream of gold and silver, all pouring into one imperial piggy bank. And here's a crucial point. This immense personal wealth, which Gibbon calculated for his readers back in the 18th century, was totally separate from the state's main revenue. And this private fortune? It was all about funding a just staggering level of personal luxury for the emperor. And right there, you start to get a hint of where this empire's real priorities were. This wasn't just a palace. It was pure theater. Gibbon shares this wild description of the emperor's throne room. a mechanical marvel designed to overwhelm and intimidate anyone who walked in. It showed off a level of wealth so extreme, it could literally create its own artificial golden nature. It's just incredible.
But you know, this constant performance of power, it came with a hidden cost. All that gold and all that elaborate ceremony created a system that wasn't just powerful, it was also rigid, fragile, and ultimately, a cage.
So imagine you're a Western ambassador. This is what you go through, as recorded by Gibbon. This isn't diplomacy, it's performance art. The whole point was to project this godlike majesty, to make the emperor seem completely untouchable, almost otherworldly. It was a pageant, not a real negotiation.
And Gibbon, he saw right through it. He argued that this obsession with ritual was really a symptom of decay. See, when you're real, effective power starts to fade. The performance of power becomes everything. In his view, it was just a substitute for actual strength. And this obsession with pageantry led them to invent a whole dictionary of increasingly elaborate and, let's be honest, meaningless titles. You get names like Pan-Hypersebastos, which means the all-hyper-revered one. Your rank wasn't determined by your job or your skill, but by how close you could get to the emperor, in what Gibbon called an emulation of servitude.
So here's the crazy irony. The very system designed to elevate the emperor ultimately trapped him. He became a prisoner of his own pageantry, surrounded by these rigid rules that controlled his every word, his every move. The gilded cage, it had locked from the inside.
Okay, so that brings us to the military. I mean, with all this money and all this organization, you'd expect an absolutely invincible army, right? Well, how did this magnificent empire actually defend itself? According to Gibbon, the Byzantine military was, at its core, completely risk-averse. Now, they wrote these huge, extensive manuals on tactics, but their actual strategy was almost never about achieving victory. The real goal was just not to lose, to delay, to defend, and to survive another day. And when Gibbon compares the armies of the time, he notes the Saracens had religious zeal and the Franks had raw courage. But the Byzantines? The Greeks? They had money and theory. Their weakness, summed up in this pretty harsh description from the era, was a cold hand and a loquacious tongue. In other words, they could talk a good fight, but they totally lacked that essential warrior spirit.
And you see this same exact pattern, this possession of the form but not the spirit, extended even to their greatest asset, all that preserved knowledge from the ancient world.
I mean, just look at this list. They were the custodians of pretty much the entire intellectual inheritance of ancient Greece. Their libraries held a treasure trove of philosophy, history, drama, stuff that had been totally lost to the West.
But here is the tragedy. This is Gibbon's point. Having the books just wasn't enough. Sure, they read them, they praised them, they compiled endless summaries and commentaries on them. But their souls, as he so devastatingly puts it, were incapable of thought and action. They were the librarians of genius, not geniuses themselves. This is maybe Gibbon's most devastating verdict of all. 1,000 years of access to the greatest minds in history, and it produced absolutely nothing new. No new philosophy, no new science, no new art. It was a millennium of just imitation.
So, what does this all add up to? You have wealth without valor, knowledge without creativity, power without any real purpose. What is the final takeaway from Gibbon's portrait of this remarkable and, let's face it, deeply perplexing empire? Well, the term for it is glorious stagnation. See, the Byzantine Empire didn't just fail in the traditional sense, it lasted for 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. It wasn't a ruin, it was more like a perfectly preserved monument to a time long past, magnificent to look at, but completely frozen in time. And for Gibbon, this right here was the root cause. The Byzantines saw themselves as the sole inheritors of civilization, surrounded by what they considered barbarians. And that self-satisfied pride meant they felt they had no one to compete with, no one to challenge them. And without competition, Well, they just stopped trying to get better. And this leaves us with a final, really provocative thought. The Byzantine Empire survived for centuries, outlasting all its rivals. But as we've seen through Gibbon's eyes, its story really forces us to ask what it truly means for a civilization to thrive. Is it enough to simply endure? Or does success require something more? The spirit to create, to innovate, and to build a future, not just preserve the past.
Welcome, everyone. Today, we're digging into a story that might just flip how you think about one of the biggest turning points in Western history. It's a tale of rebellion, of persecution, and of an idea so powerful, it just refused to die.
So, we all learn about Martin Luther in school, right? He's the guy who kicked off the Protestant Reformation. But what if that's not really the beginning of the story? What if he wasn't the first domino, but the last one to fall in a chain of rebellion that started almost 1,000 years before him?
To really see how this all connects, we're going to follow a single, radical idea across nearly a millennium. We're going to watch as it sparks a rebellion, somehow survives being forcibly moved across an entire continent, and eventually sets the stage for a revolution that would change the world forever.
So our story doesn't start in 16th century Germany. No. We have to go back way, way earlier, to the eastern fringe of the Byzantine Empire.
So, who exactly were these early dissenters?
Well, they were known as the Paulicians. Their founder, a man named Constantine, managed to get his hands on a copy of the New Testament, which back then was a rare and frankly dangerous thing for an ordinary person to own. He and his followers read it and came to a radical conclusion. The official church had gotten lost in rituals and man-made traditions. Their goal? It was simple, really. Strip all of that away and get back to the faith they found in the book itself.
And this right here, this really gets to the heart of the whole conflict. On one side, you've got the imperial church with its sacred icons, its worship of saints, its miraculous relics. And on the other side, you have the Paulicians. To them, those icons were just wood and paint, holy relics were nothing more than a heap of bones and ashes, and every single believer was simply a fellow pilgrim. They threw out the entire hierarchy. I mean, this was a clash of two totally different realities.
As you can imagine, this simple faith was seen as a direct attack on the establishment, and the empire's response was absolutely savage. For 150 years, the Paulicians were hunted down without mercy. The scale of the violence is just staggering. According to the historian Gibbon, one ruler alone, the Empress Theodora, is said to have had 100,000 of them killed. The objective here wasn't just punishment, it was total annihilation. But, this kind of brutality, it has a way of backfiring. Take this incredible story. The founder Silvanus is captured. The imperial officer in charge, a man named Simeon, orders Silvanus' own followers to stone him to death, but they all refuse. Simeon is so struck by their conviction that he ends up converting. The persecutor becomes a believer and eventually a celebrated martyr for the very cause he was sent to destroy.
After a century and a half of this, something finally had to give. And it did. The persecuted decided to stop turning the other cheek. The rebellion was sparked by a military leader named Carbius, and for him, this was personal. After imperial inquisitors had his own father impaled, he defected from the army, gathered 5,000 followers, and carved out a rebel state for them in the mountains. For the first time, the persecuted were fighting back. And their sheer defiance is captured perfectly in this quote. When the emperor sent a message to negotiate a peace deal, the new Paulician leader basically told him, "Sure, you can have peace. Just give us the entire eastern half of the empire. If not, we'll throw you off the throne." They weren't just victims anymore. They were a rival power dictating terms.
So the empire does eventually crush the rebellion. But here's the thing. You can't kill an idea with a sword. And the empire's next move, which was supposed to solve the Paulician problem for good, would accidentally guarantee that their ideas would spread even further.
The empire's big solution? Deportation. They uprooted entire Paulician communities from their homeland and moved them to the Balkans to act as frontier guards. They thought they were exporting a problem, but what they were actually doing was planting a seed. Because now, this anti-authoritarian, scripture-focused idea was in Europe,
and it started to spread among people who were just as fed up with the Church of Rome.
And this is the crucial link. Once the idea was in Europe, it took on new names and new places. But that core spirit of protest, it stayed exactly the same.
The historian Edward Gibbon makes this incredible argument that you can actually trace a direct, unbroken line of descent. It goes from the Paulicians to a group called the Bogomils in the Balkans, then to the Albigensians in France, all the way to early reformers like Wycliffe and Huss. And finally, it culminates with Luther and the Protestant Reformation. He saw it as the secret succession of rebels, all united by their opposition to the power of Rome.
And you see history just repeating itself. In the 13th century, the Albigensians in France were completely wiped out in a brutal crusade ordered by the Pope. It's a chilling, almost perfect echo of what happened to the Paulicians centuries earlier, which just goes to show how threatening this idea continued to be.
But here's the twist. Where the Paulicians and the Albigensians were ultimately crushed, the Protestant reformers of the 16th century, they finally succeeded. They did what all their predecessors could only dream of doing. They broke the absolute authority of the Pope and put the power of the Bible and individual conscience front and center.
But this leaves us with one last, really provocative question. The Reformers championed freedom of conscience to justify their own rebellion, but once they got into power, many of them were just as quick and just as harsh in punishing anyone who dissented from their new doctrines. So, did they really break the chain of authority, or did they just forge a new one? Was the goal true freedom of thought, or was it just a changing of the guard? It's a question that echoes all the way back to those first heretics in the mountains.
All right, let's get into it. Today we're telling a massive story of empires on the brink, of warriors pouring out of the north, and ultimately of how whole nations were born. This is the story of three incredible peoples, the Bulgars, the Hungarians, and the Rus. We're going to see how they rose up to challenge the greatest empire of their time, and, in the process, literally redrew the map of Europe.
I want to start with this quote from the great historian Edward Gibbon because it just sets the scene so perfectly. For centuries, the Danube River was it. That was the line, the northern border of the Roman world. But Gibbon says between the 7th and 12th centuries, that line was just erased. A new deluge was coming, and the old world was about to get washed away. So, you might be asking, why then? What was going on? Well, the thing is, the Byzantine Empire, which is really the Eastern Roman Empire, was completely distracted. All its best legions, its focus, its money, it was all tied up in these massive wars in the East against the Caliphates. They were fighting for their lives in places like Syria and even defending their own capital, Constantinople. This created a huge power vacuum up in the Balkans, leaving the door wide open for ambitious new groups coming out of the vast plains they called Scythia. Okay, so let's jump in with our first group, the Bulgarians. And you gotta understand, these guys weren't just raiders looking for a quick score. No, they were empire builders. They set up a seriously powerful kingdom right on Byzantium's front porch, and then had the audacity to crown their own tsars, their own emperors, in a direct challenge to Constantinople.
The relationship between these two empires, well, it was written in blood. This timeline here is like a highlight reel of their brutal century-long rivalry. And look at these points. It kicks off with a Roman emperor's skull being turned into a cup, and it ends with the Byzantine emperor ordering one of the most horrifying acts of revenge in all of military history.
Just listen to these words. This is the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus in the year 811. He'd marched his army deep into Bulgaria, burned their capital, and arrogantly refused any offer of peace. But then he found his retreat completely cut off. He was trapped, his army was annihilated, and the Bulgarian leader, Khan Krum, had Nicephorus' skull plated with silver and used it as his personal drinking cup. Absolutely savage.
Now, the Bulgarian threat really peaked under this guy, Tsar Simeon. And what a fascinating figure he was. See, he was no simple warrior chieftain. Simeon had been educated in Constantinople itself. He was trained in Greek philosophy and rhetoric. He was actually a monk before he traded his robes for a crown and a sword. So you had this incredible mix of Byzantine sophistication and this raw, ferocious ambition to conquer the empire that taught him everything.
But after centuries of war, the Byzantine response was just as brutal. The Emperor Basil II finally, decisively crushed the Bulgarian army. And to make sure they never rose again, he took 15,000 prisoners. He then ordered every single one of them to be blinded, leaving only one man in every 100 with a single eye just so they could lead their broken comrades home. It said the Bulgarian Tsar literally died of a heart attack when he saw them. This act earned Basil the nickname Bulgar Slayer, and it was the end of the First Bulgarian Empire.
So just as the Bulgarian fire has finally stamped out, a new terror sweeps in from the east, the Magyars, who we know as the Hungarians. For the better part of a century, their lightning-fast raids would make them the absolute scourge of Europe.
So what made the Hungarians so terrifying? It was their whole way of fighting. They were masters of the feigned retreat. They pretend to run, lure their enemies into a disorganized chase, and then, without even stopping, they turn in the saddle and fire a devastating volley of arrows at a full gallop. They were fast, they were unpredictable, they lived off the land, they were less like a traditional army and more like a force of nature.
And the panic they caused was everywhere. I mean, from monasteries in Germany to cities in the heart of Italy, churches actually added this line to their regular prayers. That tells you everything you need to know. Nobody felt safe. Their raids went as far as France, even Spain, and they left a trail of smoldering ruins wherever they went. So how in the world do you fight an enemy like that? Well, the German king, Henry the Fowler, he figured it out. And his answer wasn't to try and outride them, it was all about discipline. He taught his heavily armored knights to just hold their ground, form a shield wall, let that first wave of arrows just clatter against their armor, and then, before the Hungarians could reload, charge. It was simple, it was incredibly brave, and you know what? It worked. But the Hungarian impact on Europe was permanent. These raids literally changed the physical landscape of the continent. To protect themselves, towns started building stone walls. Lords and barons began seriously fortifying their castles. So this whole era of terror is directly responsible for creating that classic medieval world of walled cities and stone fortresses that we all picture in our minds.
And now for our third and final group, the Rus. Their story's a little different. They didn't start as this giant migrating horde. Nope, they began as Scandinavian adventurers, basically Vikings, who the Byzantines called Varangians. They sailed south down the great rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, first as traders and mercenaries, and later as rulers.
The entire foundation of their power was this absolutely insane trade route. It was this perilous, back-breaking journey that connected the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Black Sea. I mean, look at this. They'd load up canoes with furs, honey, and slaves, navigate these huge, dangerous rivers, and at one point, they had to physically drag their boats and their cargo overland for 6 miles to get around impassable rapids. All of that for a shot at trading for the silks and silver of Constantinople.
But here's the thing with the Rus. For them, trade and raiding were basically two sides of the same coin. They didn't just want to trade with Constantinople, they wanted to sack it. They launched these repeated, massive naval assaults right on the city itself. Can you imagine seeing over 1,000 Viking-style longboats suddenly appearing at the city's harbor? The threat was enormous. It was only the Byzantines' secret weapon, Greek fire, that managed to keep them out.
So what finally tamed the Rus? Well, the answer wasn't a bigger wall or a better weapon. It all came down to this powerful contrast. The Rus prince, Vladimir of Kiev, he started out as a hardcore pagan, worshipping gods like Perun, the god of thunder, even making human sacrifices to him. But then he sent his envoys to Constantinople. And when they came back, they were just awestruck. They described the beauty of the Hagia Sophia Cathedral, saying it was like hearing a choir of angels. That vision, plus the unbelievable political prize of marrying the Byzantine emperor's own sister, was enough. Vladimir converted.
And that right there brings us to our conclusion. Because the stories of the Bulgarians, the Hungarians, and the Rus, they all end up in a remarkably similar place. Their journey from pagan raiders to Christian kingdoms was really the birth of a whole new European order. You see, the ultimate solution to the whole barbarian problem wasn't winning more battles. It was assimilation. It was bringing them into the fold. By converting to Christianity and being accepted into the family of nations, their destructive energy got channeled into something new. Suddenly, making war on your Christian neighbors was a sin, and plunder gave way to politics. And in the end, that's what happened. These 3 fierce, nomadic peoples became settled nations. They founded the kingdoms of Bulgaria, Hungary, and the Kievan Rus, which is the ancestor of modern Russia and Ukraine. They started building, not just burning. They adopted laws, built incredible churches, and established a new, stable, Christian civilization in the north.
And so, that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Was this incredible transformation a genuine spiritual awakening for these peoples? Or was it one of the most brilliant political moves in history, simply trading the sword for the cross as the ultimate tool to gain legitimacy, power, and a permanent seat at the table of nations? The real answer, as is so often the case with history, is probably somewhere in the middle.